1329 says that the Amorites live in the hill country of Canaan. Since Gezer was located in the hill country of Canaan, he interpreted it to be an Amorite city. So who were the Amorites? They were Canaanites. Why? Because they descended from the man Canaan. And the Amorites were the most powerful of the Canaanite tribes. McAllister used Exodus 23 that mentions the Amorites' sacred stones to identify the row of sacred stones he had unearthed at Gezer. The other large stone with the flat top he identified as an altar, and the purpose of its carved-out basin was for catching the blood of sacrifices. Based on these verses, McAllister knew the site he was excavating was a Canaanite high place where Amorites had worshipped their gods. The many idols found in the area provided evidence that this was a cultic site. Among the many idols that were found was a bronze serpent representing Moloch, the king of the Amorite gods. You remember reading about Moloch in the Bible? This is how he is represented, a snake. Who do you think the snake is that's getting the Canaanites sacrifice their own children? In Deuteronomy 12:31, the Lord says to the Israelites, "You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshiping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods." Using this verse and others like it, McAllister labeled the picture of the remains of a burned human baby as a sacrificed infant buried in a jar. The severed human remains he also interpreted as evidence for child sacrifice. What was the crime? Child sacrifice. What was the evidence? The remains of sacrificed children. Think about it. What other explanation is there for burned babies in a jar around standing stones? So it's important to point out that McAllister wasn't interpreting these finds in some bizarre way. The other archaeologists that were digging in Canaanite cities were finding similar remains, and they were interpreting them in the same way. Just to give one brief example, Kathleen Kenyon was excavating in the 1950s in the Amorite city of Jericho. And in her book, Digging Up Jericho, she wrote, "There is an unpleasant suggestion of infant sacrifice. Besides one complete infant burial, a collection of infant skulls with a neck vertebrae attached, showing that the heads were cut off and not merely collected from burials." And so McAllister took the evidence of child sacrifice he had found and wrote it up in a chapter that he titled, "The Iniquity of the Amorites." It's interesting in these early days how McAllister goes a step further, and he not only uses the Bible to interpret the evidence that he finds in the ground, but he also uses it theologically to identify this is evidence for iniquity. This is evidence for sin. Why did McAllister call this child sacrifice sin? Because the Bible called it sin. Why is it sin? Because the Lord hates this practice, and it's against his law. When God gave his law to his people Israel, it was against the law to sacrifice their children. In Leviticus 18:21, God commands Israel, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Moloch." Leviticus 20 verse 2 states, "Any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Moloch is to be put to death." Child sacrifice is sin because it is against God's law, and the penalty for committing this sin was death. So God in the Bible is accusing the Amorites of committing this great evil of child sacrifice. And the archaeological evidence bears out the reality that indeed the Canaanites did practice this evil and were guilty. Now some might argue, well, the Canaanites weren't treated fairly because they didn't have God's law. God didn't give them his law. However, God has created all people to know in their hearts whether something like a practice of sacrificing children is good or evil. And it's clearly, we all know in our hearts, our conscience bearing witness, that it is an evil practice. So everyone is without excuse.